Hey, this is Ari. Welcome back to the show. In this episode, I am speaking with Dr. Eric Gordon, who is a unique person in many different ways. Unique in the way his mind works, unique in his brilliance, in his humility, in his extraordinary depth of knowledge and experience, particularly with chronic complex illness. He's been in clinical practice for over 40 years. Which is longer than I've been alive. So I turned 40 later this year, and he's been actually in clinical practice longer than 40 years. I don't know how much longer, but maybe 43, 44 years. He's been doing this a long time. He's seen many, many thousands of patients, and he really has a level of experience, particularly again with chronic complex illness, that is hard to find anywhere else. I had the pleasure of meeting him for the first time a couple months ago as I was one of the speakers. I'm honored that I was chosen as one of the speakers for his upcoming summit on long haul COVID and chronic complex illness. And we had a beautiful, fun, fascinating conversation, and just the meeting of two minds with very different sets of experience and very different I don't want to say paradigms, but very different approaches to health and areas of focus, created this wonderfully fertile ground for conversation and sort of synthesis and creativity and new ideas coming out of it. And we wanted to continue that by him coming on the show. I invited him to come speak here and share his experience and expertise around chronic complex illness and chronic fatigue. He is, in addition to someone who's been in clinical practice for over 40 years, he's also engaged in clinical research. And in 2007 to 2009, he created a series of medical symposia bringing together leading international medical researchers and cutting-edge clinicians focusing on ME/CFS, Lyme disease, autoimmune diseases, and autism. He's also worked directly with Dr. Robert Naviaux, who is someone that I often reference and cite, someone I've had the pleasure of meeting and spending some time at his lab for mitochondrial medicine at the University of California, San Diego. And he's done, Dr. Naviaux has done groundbreaking research into metabolomics and mitochondrial function and chronic inflammatory disease, autism, and chronic fatigue. In 2016, Dr. Gordon, who I'm interviewing here, was co-author with Dr. Naviaux on a groundbreaking study called Metabolic Features of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, which is a study that I've often cited in my work. And this is an absolute pleasure to get to interview one of the researchers of a paper that has been so central to my ideas and my work and the Energy Blueprint, and just a wonderfully brilliant human being with so much expertise to share with the world. If I can offer one bit of commentary or suggestion before you dive into this podcast, some of this conversation might be a little bit inaccessible. He and I are kind of jumping in where we're already talking about, Dr. Naviaux's work, the cell danger response. Maybe some concepts aren't fully explained to somebody who's never heard these ideas before. So we're kind of going into it with the assumption that the listener has some bit of pre-existing familiarity with our work or with this general topic. So please forgive me for that. Normally, I think I try to do a good job of making things very accessible, but this was something that just the nature of the conversation was between him and I was such that it's maybe a little less accessible than normal. In addition to that, I think, as you'll hear from him directly, the way his mind works is kind of very circular, and there are sort of layers of ideas and connections are being made in real time, and he'll be talking about this and then he'll want to connect it over here, and sometimes I do the same. And forgive us if the conversation feels maybe discombobulated or not as neatly organized and presented in this sort of step-by-step fashion. But having said that, if you have chronic complex illness, I really think that this episode is going to be very valuable for you. And I think I even want to go so far as to suggest to you that you might want to listen to it twice to really get the different nuggets and start to make some of the connections here. I think there's some gold nuggets here for sure. So stick with it. It's a long podcast. There's a lot of back and forth between he and I. But again, I think you're gonna, if you have chronic complex illness, I think you'll get a lot of value from this discussion. So enjoy this conversation with Dr. Eric Gordon. So welcome to the show, Dr. Gordon. Such a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, a real pleasure to be here with you, Ari. I must say, the first time we chatted, I just felt, my God, I found somebody I like to talk to, and since then, I've actually been listening to your podcast, and I really love them.
Oh, awesome! That's so great to hear. And I've listened to podcasts that you've been on as well. I really loved our conversation as well. I've been excited to do this interview with you on my podcast, and I think, one thing that would be useful for listeners to understand is, we had a lot of discussion in the initial podcast around sort of our different approaches and areas of focus when it comes to human health. I've really focused on human optimization, like how do we sort of optimize the human function? How do we go from sort of the typical standard norm of society to a more functional brain and body, and looking at how do we sleep better, how do we have more energy, how do we enhance our mitochondria, our brain function, our mood, all these kinds of questions. And you've spent decades focused on working with the hardest cases in the world, the extremes of chronic complex illness that is incredibly difficult to figure out, and just endless webs of biochemistry and mechanisms and testing and endless complexity. And I think also there was something you said in our initial conversation that really stuck out to me about you, and I think that this speaks volumes about the kind of person you are. You said something to the effect of, anybody in your field who works with chronic complex illness, who tells you that they have a 90 or 100% success rate with their patients, is full of SHIT. Something to that effect. I might not be quoting you exactly.
It just means they're not paying attention to their failures.
Mm-hmm.
It's just because, when people, what I find so exciting is that your work with optimization, we need those same tools to help people who are ill. Just we have to approach it from a gentler beginning. But the same, this is the point, is that it's the same system. When you're, and everything we learn about the really, really sick people gives information that allows people who want to optimize their health to do it better, and vice versa. And actually you sent me your breathing course, your breath course. And what I loved about that is that you're the first person I've seen who's put out a course like that to really help people who are athletes, but also had that section for like, hey, this same stuff is going to help you if you can't get off the couch.
Yes,
if you're bedbound, you can do this. You just have to do it a little gentler.
Yep.
Because it's and so that the cross fertilization between the fields, I think, is amazing. Every time people come up with a new, I know you don't like that word hack, but a new way in to like optimize. We find that, hey, if we modulate that a little bit, it really will help people who are really down, at the right time. And I think that is the other part. Is I have a saying that I made this up like 20 something years ago. I was at a meeting, like I had moved into Santa Rosa, and there were like 40 people involved in the healing arts. Everybody, all different flavors, and they went around the room and they said what they did, and all I could say at the end was, everything works sometimes.
Even
You know?
even nothing works
Yeah.
sometimes. The placebo.
Well, I mean, placebo is to me, and I've been playing with some different kinds of medicines over the last few years, but still, and I realized intention, okay, and the ability to connect to a higher power, whatever it may be, just it can be emptiness, but the ability to connect to something more than you, okay, is the gate to healing for many, many people. I mean, that's why people have prayed, and prayer does work. I mean, it's everybody needs something different, but the intention, because that's to me, what placebo is intention. And when you, if you want something to work, you're talking to your body. Because one of the things we're going to talk about today is the cell danger response, and the reason I'll throw that in now, and the reason this is perfect, because I was trying to think why is it important? It's a story. The cell danger response is a story to explain how our body defends itself, protects itself. Okay, and when you start thinking about it, you realize that the center, the center point, if you will, or the key component that's focused on in the cell danger response is the mitochondria. And I know I've heard you speak about, that you really fully get Dr. Navio's work, that the mitochondria is not just energy producing, but it also has a big role to play in how your immune system works and how your body defends itself. Well, but we have to one little factoid, and I hope I'm right, this is a correct one, is that when you go to sleep, your energy production in your body kind of drops about 25% within like 6 seconds, something like that. So there's communication from up here that affects every cell in your body really rapidly. So when your will is attuned, everything's going to work better. And that's basically placebo.
There's a field of research. I don't know if you're familiar with this research that exists and these researchers, but this field of research is called mitochondrial psychobiology. And I've had one researcher on the podcast. His name is Martin Picard. He's done a number of interesting studies in this field of mitochondrial psychobiology, but they look at exactly what you're talking about. They do experiments to figure out how what's going on in the mind psychologically is affecting the mitochondria, and it happens, as you said, within seconds.
Yeah. And no, I wasn't. I love it. Thank you. I'm going to explore that because, and we do work. I mean, that's what I mean. I call them toys, which is really inappropriate, probably. But all the devices that doctors and people trying to optimize their health use, all the different lights, and from lights out here to putting lights into your veins to irradiating your blood to all the it's energy and water. I mean, like, so we have it's sort of saying it's there's so many ways of talking to the body. Okay, and the trick is to find what notes your body likes. What you resonate with. It's just like anything in life. I mean, like if you hate living in the cold and damp, you're probably, if you move, you actually feel better and do better. And some people love the cold and damp. We're different. And it's the refusal of medicine to acknowledge the difference in people, is what leads to the debacle. Actually, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too much, but we were talking a little bit, the debacle of vaccines and COVID is the refusal to acknowledge that we're biochemically a bit different, and sometimes radically so. And so you have to have a discussion that allows for difference. And in our current medical situation, we're treating people as though we're all came off the same assembly, the same assembly line with the exact same parts.
Yeah. I want to, there's two possible digressions we could go on right now. One is vaccines and COVID. And I think we'll leave that one aside right now because it's so
Yeah, I think so.
polarizing and we have a problem
Yeah.
of, if I'll do a very brief treatment of it, but just from a meta perspective, not taking any sides here or expressing my own views. But I think the problem with even entering that discussion right now is the whole topic of COVID has become so politicized. We have a scientific topic that should just be explored dispassionately, objectively, from a scientific perspective. And then we have political parties that have politicized the crap out of it and created totally distorted scientific sounding narratives, such that these two political parties, the people in them, and who are listening to news from their particular bias, are now operating in totally different realities, where they both think that they're in possession of the scientific truth, and they're both extraordinarily unaware and blind to the fact of just the extent to which what they think is the science of COVID and vaccines has been politicized, has been propagandized, and all these forces that have shaped these narratives. But so if we enter that discussion, we will necessarily piss off a lot of people who are not in whatever realities we're talking about. So we'll leave that one aside.
I just want to, and just join you in that is just say is that there is no black and white.
Mm-hmm.
And like you throw the I Ching, like there's only 80% is gray, at least, and science is politics. It always has been. It's more akin to religion. Okay. When you get to medical science, because, if you build a bridge, okay, you're going to get 100 engineers. If the bridge, they're all going to agree that that's a reasonable bridge. Okay. But when you have a sick person and you get 10 doctors, you're going to get like probably 7 different opinions, and they will be all kind of right.
Yeah,
because
and that, sorry, go ahead.
No, just because we didn't in engineering, we're using a science that we created, okay? Because engineering works best when we use substances that we create, like, concrete, steel, but when you build things out of wood, then you have to deal with the fact that it's alive and it's wood and it changes over time in ways that you can't always predict, because we don't know, we didn't come with we don't know how things work. I think that is the thing that's so difficult, is most educated people think that doctors and medical science know things in much greater detail and precision than we do.
Yes.
Okay. We are very good at bullet wounds, heart attacks, broken bones. Yeah, we can put you together. But when it comes to how you heal, we don't know how that happens. Okay. That is what people don't get, is that yes, we can keep you from dying, but then getting well and healing, that is the work of approximation and again, and finding your own truth in your own body of what works for you. We have lots of ideas, and again, all your work about body optimization gives us a good lens that, these are probably reasonable things to do. But as you well know, there are some exercises. Well, put it like this: if you're a hypermobile, we're going to talk about this a little bit at the end, I hope. If you're a hypermobile person, or not even hypermobile, but if you're 60 years old and you can still palm the floor without doing a lot of exercise beforehand, you're a little more mobile than the average bear, okay? And just being that means that you probably should, that doing yoga 5 days a week is probably not the best exercise for you.
Yeah.
Okay, it's that simple. You should be doing some weight training. You should be carefully.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And so that's the kind of simplistic thing on that level that the world doesn't pay attention to. People think we know about people, and we don't, because Okay, I'm ranting here. So that's it. Let's move on to the. I'll
No, I
let you
want
run the ship.
I want to talk more about that. I think it's actually an important point that you're bringing up there, because I find that there's an astounding gap between the general public's perception of how evidence-based, quote unquote, and how scientific modern medicine is versus the reality of it. And I think my criticism also extends actually to functional medicine. And let me,
Totally.
I'll build this out with a few quick examples. But well, there's so many examples. How about this? There's as one point of reference, in order for drugs to be approved, they go through this process. Usually takes like an average of 5 years for them to do all of this efficacy, and then animal studies, and then long-term safety testing in humans before we get a clear enough picture that that substance is safe enough to be sold to the and prescribed to the public.
Yeah, often more like 10, 15 these days.
Yes. Okay. And then of the except in the case, this we could go on a digression here about drugs and vaccines and how quickly they're approved and liability and how that plays into it, whether they can be sued for damages, and how long the drug companies want to study something for safety, depending on whether they can or cannot be sued for harms from it. We'll leave that aside. Again, for reasons explained earlier. But after it goes through this 5-10 year process of safety testing, of those drugs that are deemed safe and effective and get approved, something like, I'm forgetting the exact number, but it's somewhere between 30 to 40%. It's almost I think it's around 1 in 3 drugs that go through all of that process are later found to get a severe enough warning that they either receive a black box warning or which means that there's some very severe side effect of concern, or they're removed from the market entirely, right? So all you have to do to really understand how quote unquote scientific things are, and I should say more directly, to understand how little we actually know, while at the same time people are saying we know everything there is to know. We've studied this for 5 years. Of course we know it's safe. Da 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 da. Or worse, we've studied this for 6 months and we're claiming to know it's safe. But even in cases where we do have that long-term research, still something like 1 out of 3 drugs ends up later getting a black box warning or is removed from the market. So you see that our perception of how much we know changes dramatically just by extending things out a few years later. Oh, it's like, oh, looking back a few years ago, oh, we actually didn't know that Vioxx causes strokes and kills a bunch of people. We thought it was just an effective painkiller. Right.
And it wasn't, and it was an amazingly effective medicine.
Yes,
For what
absolutely.
it was supposed to do, with a little problems on the side.
Yes.
And
okay. Now,
I just want to throw in one thing here to counterpoint to this is airplanes. Okay. We make airplanes.
Yeah.
How many airplanes fall out of the sky because of mechanical error? Not many. Considering the hundreds, if we don't make drugs anywhere near as well as we can make planes, because even like the Max 737, that was more pilot error. It was a screw up, and they didn't have pilots trained well enough to override it. But still, this doesn't happen when we build stuff.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's kind of, we can certainly engineer amazing things. I agree with that, engineer amazing technology, but it's different when you're tinkering with the human system.
Well, that's my point, is that, and unfortunately in society today, because people have gotten used to their iPhones working and their laptops working and they don't get that they're still more complicated and we don't understand them.
Yes. Okay, now let me add one more layer to this, and I I don't want to speak too long here, but I think it's worth building this out for people. And then I want to get your feedback on this landscape as somebody with so much expertise in chronic complex illness. I went personally to a functional medicine doctor recently, maybe 6 months ago, because I was interested in just going through a panel. I'd actually never done a full functional medicine workup. And so I wanted the works, and I wanted to see, I went to a very highly regarded practitioner. I said, like, let's find out if there's anything that I can work on, anything I can optimize. Let's do very comprehensive testing, nutritional panels, gut microbiomes, give me the works, organic acids, everything. And because I know some things about this area, I said, the guy wanted to do a gut microbiome test on me. And I said, well, I'd actually like to do 2 others in addition to the one that you're saying you want to do. I want to do 2 others using different technologies. Because I know that certain technologies will arrive at certain conclusions, and I want to cross-check. So any findings that you tell me that I have going on with my gut microbiome, I want to cross-check and verify with other tests. It was very interesting that I did that, because when I got back those tests, I had not just one, but probably at least 5 or 6 examples of massive discrepancies between the results on these tests. One told me I had high lactobacilli count. The other told me low. High bifidobacteria, the other told me low. One told me that in terms of short chain fatty acids, I have almost no butyrate production. The other one told me I have off the charts butyrate production. And on and on and on. I mean, I could give you five or 6 more examples of key discrepancies. And anybody who knows about the gut microbiome knows those things I'm talking about: lactobacilli, bifidobacteria, butyrate production. These are not trivialities of gut health. These are key findings. If I had not done those other tests, this doctor would have read this report to me, this very, very scientific looking report that we would assume this is very advanced technology. This is giving me a window of insight into my physiology. That, you know, it looks very impressive, very sciencey. Yet who knows? And so he would have given me a report of what's going on and prescriptions based on that. That who knows if any of that is actually real or not, because I did another different test that gave me totally different results. So how many people are out there who are getting tests like this done and who are getting diagnosed with something based on those tests, and then getting a whole regimen, a whole protocol, a whole set of prescription, being put on drugs and all sorts of things based on test results that may not even be real?
Yes. Well, you see, that's why I treat sick people. No, seriously, this is really funny. I mean, it's because 30. I did regular medicine. I call it regular medicine. Hospital-based medicine for about 12 years. But this was my dream. I studied with Jeff Bland in the 80s before he, like. He was, it was Jeff and 10 other people, but anyway, but I was still doing regular medicine at that time. And then in 92, I went for it anyway. But one of the things that just made me uncomfortable right off was people would come to me for health optimization. And I didn't know what to do, because at that point I had been interested in diet since I was a teenager. And I went to medical school actually to learn about what the right diet was. But in 6 months, I realized that was a waste.
They fooled you, and then you went through several years and discovered they didn't teach you anything about nutrition.
No, it took 3 months. I was in medical school. They had no clue. I invited Ann Wigmore, if ever heard of Ann. From my medical school in my freshman year. That went over well. But anyway, but the point is that what stopped me was I didn't even know what the right diet was for people. you know, and I quickly did, you know, and the testing we had back then was relatively primitive to now, but still there was a lot. We had stool tests back then. I mean, that was Great Plain, that was no, Great Smokies was the test that later became Genova. Anyway, the point is that it was clear to me that we didn't know what was normal. We didn't know what was optimal. I didn't know if somebody's cholesterol should be high or low. You know, it was, but sick people were easy. I mean, because they were sick, I needed to help them fix something, you know? So when I did a stool test on a sick person and it was really way off and it fit them, I didn't mind doing something about it. But like you said, when I do, when even, or we would do, we didn't, some of the more esoteric testing on, you know, cytokine levels and inflammatory markers. And, you know, when people are healthy, what are you doing? You know, sometimes you can see something way off. Okay. But if it's just within, like, you know, we shouldn't be fixing what we don't know is broken, is the bottom line. And that's the problem with exactly what you said, because I have done that many times. We did that with, and the difficulty is that sometimes these things are so useful. We did that with allergy tests. In the 90s, I worked with Norm Shealy for a year. Norm, I don't, people maybe don't know who Norm is, but he was a neurosurgeon. He was the guy who developed the implantable spinal stimulators back in the 60s. And then he went on to realize that, again, intention and teaching people how to be happy is the way to treat chronic pain. He had a chronic pain clinic. He was actually a neurosurgeon, but was a big devotee of Edgar Cayce, of all things. It was an interesting world out there. But the point is, we did allergy tests on people. And we had patients who said, I don't believe that. And we did double, and we would get different answers, you know, for food allergy testing, which is real. On the same token, I still do them, but with that, is it real is always in my mind. Okay. And I think the really good doctors out there do that. They, you know, the problem is we're training a lot of people to just use these tests as though we're doing CBCs, you know, complete blood counts. A complete blood count, even that changes day to day a bit, but a complete blood count, you know, if the number's way off, it's probably real. You know, we've done these on a billion people, billions by now, you know, so we have some, but we're doing so many of the functional medicine tests are checked on, like, you know, 50 normal people once in the beginning when they start running them, and then they run them on tens of thousands of people, you know, and that's not good enough. You know, you really need, you know, thousands of controls, but nobody spends the money on this. You know, and so it is one of the, I didn't mean to be airing the dirty laundry of functional medicine, but I think that is a big issue. I've often felt that the companies that are making literally fortunes on these testings, if it's like drug companies, if they really wanted to be honorable, they should be spending a significant amount of money on validating their tests over and over again.
And that's just, that point is very interesting, because I think, you know, when I was younger, for example, I would make the assumption that if a test exists, the company who produced that, who created that test, must have sent it through years and years and years to make sure that it's valid, to make sure that it's accurate, to make sure that it's repeatable. And that any doctor who's using it must have also verified that it's accurate and valid and repeatable. And you get older and you learn more about these things, and you're like, for me, it's just been shocking to realize that all these assumptions that I made about how rigorously scientific stuff was is just not at all that way.
Nope.
Yeah.
It is not. That is what patients don't want to hear or understand. And I can't blame them, because these tests are expensive. I mean, I sometimes have people spend several $1,000s on tests that I know are only kind of okay. But because I've used them for a long time, they give me information. And if it triangulates with other pieces of information and the patient in front of me, and they respond, it means something. I mean, we have this issue, even with, because many of the biochemical tests, they're they're um, they're valid in the sense, like if you send something away for a mass spec, well, they have the clear, they have people, they have pathologists who come in and they check and make sure that those machines are running, and so the results are quote unquote accurate. But what does that mean in your body?
Mhm.
That's what we don't know.
Mhm.
you know
Yeah.
and the issue with the PCR and the next gen sequencing is that I don't know how much a few companies really do validations, but I don't think all of them do.
Mhm.
Because I'm not sure at what level I'm not sure at the level of their CLIA, how often they have to send out samples and get samples to make sure they're valid. I don't know. I mean, for the blood tests, I know they have to be, but for some of the tissue samples, like stool, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a good point. But so it's a difficult world because um, we don't want to, it costs too much money to do things as perfectly as we'd like. So we want to be careful, because what happens is, like, we don't want to do what the FDA has done. The FDA has made it so I knew a guy who made this incredible neurofeedback device using the tongue. It was brilliant. It was so good. He made the mistake of thinking that he could get it approved by the FDA, and he got investors. And the last I met him, the last time I spoke to him was like 4 years ago, and he had spent $36 million and on tests, because it cost a fortune to do good studies on people. They're very expensive, and he still wasn't approved. And he just should have just marketed it as another stupid, biofeedback device,
Instead of
without
instead of a medical device.
instead of a medical device, and he would be out there making money, but B, most importantly, his device was really cool. It really works really well because you're hooking right into 3 of the cranial nerves. You stick it on the tongue. I mean, it's a cool. But anyway, that's the problem, is that when you raise the bar too high, it becomes that only big pharma has a playing field. And they're doing the same thing with the herbal things. They're going to make it harder and harder for entry. So we have to find, just like we were talking about in the story about COVID, we have to find a little common sense and a little place where people can accept a little ambiguity when necessary. And if I'm going to give you something that could kill you, or could just get you really sick, okay, I got to be really sure. I got to line up those, get those ducks in a row. I need a lot of proof before I'm going to give you an intervention that could hurt you.
Yes.
But if I'm going to give you something that may hurt you because you have idiosyncratic reactions, but you're not going to die from it, I'm not so worried, because I said in my patients, nothing is safe.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, like, water can affect some. Actually, I have to with people who water is too much. But the point is,
you tell them to go eat an apple a day keeps the doctor away, and 20% of your patients will report that they have extreme negative reactions to eating apples.
Apples. Well, maybe not 20, but maybe about 5. But the point is that something's happening. But the thing is, but I'm still willing to risk the apple. Mm-hmm. I'm not willing to risk the thing that could really lay them in bed for 2 weeks,
Yes.
and that's what, but we can't get the authorities to understand levels of risk.
Yes.
And
I've been shocked, not to digress into COVID again, but I've been shocked at the level of scientific illiteracy when it comes to being able to do basic risk benefit analyses. I mean, it's been absolutely shocking to see. It's understandable at the general public level, but to see how many medical professionals have been incapable of doing risk benefit analysis it's astounding.
It's usually like like maybe a lecture, or maybe a course in medical school if you go to a really highfalutin school, on statistics. But doctors think they're really good if they know the difference between sensitivity and specificity. Once you go to relative risk and absolute risk, you lost. I mean, so that's why they get away with this absolute BS,
Yeah.
of confusing the two. It's like, yeah, there was a 20% decrease in death, but the time it was, from like, what, 5 people to 4 people,
Right, exactly. Yeah.
out of a thousand.
Yeah, 5 out of 1,000 versus 4 out of 1,000.
Yeah, it's
Right.
a 20% decrease. I mean, that's the kind of thing they sell all the
Yeah,
time.
exactly. Yeah.
And
And pharma are masters of manipulating the statistics to come out with impressive sounding stuff that once you actually look at the data, you realize is total nonsense.
yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and they bury the data. I mean, I've known many. Anyways, pharma is, boy. Yeah, pharma has gotten close to evil. I don't want to say that because I hate to. It's
We don't
up
want to
there.
speculate on intentions, but based on
It's up there.
actions, we would say it's somewhere close to evil on the spectrum.
What
Yeah.
it is that, and again, this is a great example of, like, I don't think there was a conspiracy because it was the government who said that pharma had to fund the FDA. But
Mhm.
that very action of funding the FDA gave them more and more control over the FDA. And now the FDA, I mean, the FDA is coming after our most useful substances, the things that we use every day that change people's lives, the simple IV nutrients, because IV nutrients in the right people, I mean, if you're healthy, I mean, I I was never a big IV nutrient guy because I never felt them. I'm one of those people, you give me any IV, I don't notice. I feel fine. I don't feel good before. I don't feel bad before. But I have so many patients that IV nutrients, and it's like, God, the light comes back on. IV
Wow.
phosphatidylcholine, they start to feel, their world lights up again.
Mhm.
That's real for a subset of people. And FDA is really working hard to take that away. They're looking to take away, all of our compounded hormones and things. So, I mean, just stuff that not everybody needs, but the people who need it, it's life changing, life altering, and
Yeah.
and they're doing it. I mean, I won't go. One day you should have, if you ever want the download on how this works, Dr. Paul Anderson, who is a great naturopath who teaches, he's been testifying in front of the FDA since 2011
Mhm.
on this thing. And the story, it's just incredible how science is left to the wayside.
Mhm.
Okay. And anyway, again, we're going. So I really want to get to the CDR for a reason.
Let's get there. Let's
Because
get there
the
right now.
reason I want to
So
get there is because it kind of ties in what we're talking about.
yeah.
Okay. And so just let me just a little, my main point is the cell danger response is something that, Dr. Navio gave it its name. I don't think he loves it anymore, but he's kind of stuck with it, but the thing I want people, the first thing people have to understand about it is it's just a story. It's a framework for understanding how our body works. The reason I emphasize that, I've spoken about this in medical, symposium here and there at meetings, and people come up to me and ask me afterwards, is this the CDR? When they're having a patient, and it's like, I guess I'm not very good at explaining it, because the point is the cell danger response is the immune response that's choreographed by your mitochondria. That's how you defend yourself against all threat. It doesn't matter if it's an angry neighbor or if it's a bullet or a bug. This is just your body orchestrates a response. And Dr. Navio has called that the cell danger response, and he has stuck the mitochondria in the middle of it. And I always want to remind people is that I'm sure that other smart people will find other organelles that they can say this one is in the middle of it. But I happen to find his way of looking at it very, very helpful, because it's the old story. Who's the most essential organ? The brain or the rectum, and if the rectum stops working, the brain doesn't do so well. It's a circle.
Yeah.
We need it all.
Sure.
So, but still, the mitochondria, produces energy, but it also senses the electron flow and the raw material flow in the cell. And by sensing it, it decides when things are safe, and when things are not safe, it signals the whole body. And so so where are we going with this? Why? It's just that if when you start looking at this, at the body as a system, as a network of information and flow, you can. And when somebody tells you you have long COVID, or when somebody tells you you've got chronic Lyme, or you have mast cell disease, or you've got whatever the flavor, or parasite, whatever the flavor of the month or the year is, because these things wax and wane. When I started, everything was Candida, and then it was all parasites, and then it was all Lyme, and then it was all Bartonella, and then Babesia, or Babesia Bartonella, I forget which, and and then it was all with hypercoagulability and mast cells and mold. I mean, it's everything. It just depends on your sensitivity and your exposure. Okay, so don't get hung up and don't look at lists of symptoms on the internet and decide you've got Bartonella. Because as I say, one man's Bartonella list is another man's Babesia list. Anyway, but beginning to understand that when you're chronically ill, okay, and I guess people should include in chronically ill things that we consider, well, they are chronic illness, but people sometimes forget that when you have, that when you're chronically ill, you're chronically inflamed. I guess that's my point. Okay. Chronic illness is chronic inflammation. Okay. And what people don't get is that it also includes, like, insulin resistance is chronic inflammation. Hypertension is chronic inflammation. Renal disease is chronic inflammation. It's it's just what happens when your body tries to protect itself and then can't stop. Okay, and I always compare this to psychology, because again, psychology is just a more alive model. I mean, Chinese medicine is actually a much more alive model than our current medical model, because it's alive. It understands balance. Medicine tends to do black and white. So when your mitochondria sense something is off, okay, they go through a pattern. Now, they go through a similar pattern every night or every day in something we call the health cycle, where you break down some tissue, you build up, and so your mitochondria are signaling that this cell is kind of sick, or that the mitochondria will break apart and will then decide if they're going to survive. If they decide to die, the cell decides to die. It's good, you repair it, but the repair mechanism is minor. The cell, what we call the healing cycle, is when you need the contractor. The health cycle is what you do every day. You can, like, fix the hole in the wall, with a nail hole or something, with a, maybe you can. I used to be able to, but so what the constant daily repair that we go through is the health cycle. But when we get injured, we go into the healing cycle, and that is where people get stuck. Okay, I guess I mean the point is that leads to chronic inflammation, because your mitochondria get stuck either in the first step, where they're not really producing energy at all, they're just producing ATP as a signaling molecule. Okay, and your cells are burning glucose at that point, and that's why a lot of people who are really sick feel better when they eat sugar or simple carbs, because that's what they're burning. In order to really burn fat, your mitochondria have to be working. So if your mitochondria are kind of browned out, they're busy making a little bit of ATP, but they're using that as a signaling molecule rather than as an energy production molecule. You're going to be tired, because that's what Dr. Navio used to call, I still like it, the CDR1, the first step. That's the first step in injury. You get cut, you get an local infection, you call in your innate immune systems, but the cells are busy killing a bug that's in the inside, or binding up a toxin, And when they're doing that, they're not busy making more of themselves. So the mitochondria stop making energy, which creates high oxygen tension inside the cell. Because that's another little detail, I don't know what, is that the mitochondria are the part of your cell that uses oxygen. Because not much else in the body really uses the oxygen in any significant level, okay? But the mitochondria use oxygen and make water out of it. They add hydrogen and they make water, when they finish making ATP, or just before they finish the last step. They make, so when they stop doing that, the oxygen concentration inside the cell rises, which creates oxidative stress, which is what your body is using. And Dr. Navio likes to call that oxidative shielding, because that's the first step in killing those viruses. This is a self-protective mechanism. But if you don't shut that down within a day or 2 or 3, then you've got chronic oxidative stress going on in your body. See, and you have other mechanisms to create plenty of oxidative stress. It's not the only one, but this turns it on. But what should happen is that then the nucleus, seeing the higher oxidative stress, starts pouring out chemicals that are antioxidants. And that's probably one of the reasons a lot of the herbs, which are many of them are pro-oxidants, many things like artemisinin, many of them are pro-oxidants, but they work because they stimulate the antioxidant response of the body. So you have this. So that's the CDR1, which usually should be short-lived. This is calling, and this is also where your innate immune system, the neutrophils and the macrophages are coming in. That's that first, like thinking of COVID again. That's that first week that should be happening in the first week of COVID. Unfortunately, COVID is smart enough to screw up that system in the beginning and get it to be out of balance. But oops. Let me not go there. Okay, I'm sorry. You're dealing. I interviewed Dr. Bredesen, and I was so impressed with a man who can keep everything in a very orderly fashion. My brain doesn't work that way, so I apologize to the audience. So anyway, so just to be clear, so CDR1 is this inflammatory time. During this time, you're going to have what we call sickness behavior. Sickness behavior is you're tired, you're irritable, you don't want to eat. You want to be left alone. You often have a low-grade fever, because, it's self-protective. If you live with a bunch of people and you're getting sick and you're going to be hanging out and spewing all around them, it's not healthy. I mean, it's not about masks, but, we do spread respiratory pathogens by breathing and talking. Anyway, so that's the CDR1. The CDR2 is when you're starting to heal. Okay, now you have to rebuild some of that damaged tissue. And so at this point, the mitochondria, what's interesting, they're still not making a lot of ATP, but they're making a bunch more, but they're using a lot of their energy to produce building blocks for the cell. Bigger, things that will make RNA and DNA and the building blocks. Okay, and your cells are still burning sugar. And again, this is a level that we often see in people with hypertension are stuck here, people with insulin resistance. They often have places in their body, because that's the other thing that I want to emphasize, is the CDR is a local phenomenon. It's rarely happening throughout your whole body at the same time. Usually it's wherever there is the insult. If it's the whole body, people usually die. It's called sepsis. All the organs are screwed up.
Well, there's some in between territory, right? Because let's say you have a local injury to a specific part of your body, then you have a local CDR reaction, but you don't necessarily get systemic symptoms from that. But part of the CDR, as I understand it, is the systemic level signaling of purinergic molecules, some of these energy molecules that are circulating that are causing systemic symptoms, whether those symptoms might be present in the case of autism or in the case of chronic fatigue syndrome.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the signaling that becomes systemic.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, right. The local, because you can have like 5 or 10% of your liver is inflamed. Like that's what we often see, people with cirrhosis, they have like little patches to start with because there's only some cells that are stuck in that CDR2 place where they're building tissue and they're not really communicating well with its tissues around them. Yeah, but they release chemicals. I mean, that's the whole thing about senescence. Maybe is the senescent signaling molecules that these cells that are stuck in various places in your body, in CDR1, CDR2, or even in CDR3. And let me just go run through those real quick, because the details of the CDR, it's just the idea that there's stages. So one is this acute inflammatory stage, two is this rebuilding stage, okay? But the reason I'm emphasizing the glucose metabolism is because this is like cancer cells. When cells become cancerous, they're using what we call Warburg metabolism, which people thought was like causing cancer. No, it's what the mitochondria do when you're having cells that are rapidly reproducing. they are busy making the building blocks, and the cell is using glucose to make energy, and the mitochondria are not producing are not using up as much oxygen, so they always thought that the mitochondria was disordered. I guess that's one of the important pieces of this long story is that except for maybe, I think there's like 400 known mitochondrial diseases, which are all extremely rare. Okay. And most people who have them die when they're young. The vast majority of people have normal mitochondria. Again, we are now going to the molecular level, so people are doing mitochondrial genomics on like people who are mild, and yeah, you can find that there's the SNP for like the first cytochrome. That's a big one. People are finding the first complex one in the electron transport chain, and you can have some SNP so you don't bind NAD that well, but that alone does not make you sick. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's like when you're sick, that can make it worse. And it's cool to find out that is because sometimes those people do respond to a little more NAD, which is kind of cool. But the point is that you're not sick because of that SNP. We just happened to find it because we were looking for it. So anyway, so that's CDR2 is this building, and that's where stem cells are being called in and all kinds of good things are happening. CDR3 is when these newly built cells are learning to communicate with their neighbors. Okay. And that's when the cell receptors, because remember in CDR1, one of the first things that happens is the cell membrane kind of hardens. Okay. You've got all those nice lipids, okay, with proteins in between them. And those proteins change shape and the lipids change configuration. And the cell membrane itself becomes less permeable. And it also stops taking in the signals. Okay, and this goes into my basic theme about how to help people get well is you have to restore communication throughout the system. Mm-hmm. Okay, and CDR3 is about that in a big way because that's when the cell is learning that, hey, I'm a liver cell and I have to communicate with these guys around me. And I have to send out the right signals to the rest of the body. And I'm now going to start listening to the thyroid hormones and the adrenal hormones and all that soup of information the cell is going to start listening to. Because what you have when you have senescent cells, they're not listening to the information as clearly. And they're sending out old signals, they're sending out signals that would be appropriate if you're trying to still fight something. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, when we keep doing that as we get older, we get creakier.
So in that way of speaking there, you're likening senescent cells to being in CDR, being stuck in CDR, in the CDR.
Exactly. 1, 2, or 3. It doesn't matter which one. They're senescent cells because they're releasing proteins and exosomes. Because exosomes, not just the mRNA vaccine, but exosomes are one of the major ways that we're just discovering that your body communicates. And they're like little lipids with proteins stuck in the middle. Okay. And when your cell gets sick, it starts spewing out these exosomes as communication molecules. And it keeps doing it. It's just one of the ways we communicate that they're just beginning to get. Like 20 years ago, people thought exosomes were kind of like cellular debris or, were just nothing. They didn't know what they were. Welcome to junk, junk like junk DNA, oops. there's very little junk in the system.
Yeah.
We just
Yep.
don't understand it. So anyway, so these, so when a cell is not operating back to the mature interactive cell in the community, when it's stuck in any phase of this self-protective response, it is sending out danger signals to the body. Now, again, more, luckily we are an incredibly redundant system, because every time you read about what's wrong with the body and you start going into details, you think, oh my God, I'm going to die because, I got this or I got that. And somehow we manage to keep going. Your C-reactive protein is 6. Oh my God, you're going to have a heart attack tomorrow. No. I know plenty of people in their 80s with CRPs that are high and they survive. It's we get too hung up on these numbers, like they're the only signals we know how to read so far, but they're signals out of billions of signals. We have to remember that. When people get really scared when they get an abnormal blood test, and sometimes it should, sometimes it is bad, but lots of times it's just, we should do something, but you're not going to die from it. The system is incredibly redundant and resilient. So that's the CDR 1, 2, and 3. And I knew you wanted to make another point, so I'll shut up. Okay.
So let me ask you this. So the CDR, it's worth saying, is performing a positive role as well in facilitating our survival in response to stress, in response to cellular damage, cellular threats, danger. It is an intelligent, adaptive response to respond to things that threaten us.
Yeah.
Now,
well, a thing I want to make is that it's just how your body communicates. It just that's what's so funny, is because he's identified the CDR is when, like I said, when something's really broken, but you're using that same system at a gentler level every day.
exactly.
Every time you go to sleep, your body is going through these healing cycles. And that was my clumsy analogy about, like, fixing something simple at home. That's like that's what you're doing every day.
And during hormetic stress as well, and during exercise, during cold exposure, during heat exposure, during breath holding practices, we are engaging it. We are essentially training it, and I would say resetting the system. And I think Dr. Navio, I've spoken to him in person. I had the privilege a few years back of going to his lab for mitochondrial medicine at the University of California, San Diego, having a little private session with him. And I spoke to him about hormetic stress, and he hasn't said much about it publicly, but he lit up when I started speaking to him about that, because he knew it's like pressing the reset button on the system.
It's training. It's training your system. No, I'm sorry. It's just, but that's, yeah, Bob lights up. That's what makes him fun. You give him an idea, he goes, but that's it. It's because we need to keep in training, and that's why when you're a couch potato and you get hurt, it's so hard. It hurts because the system is creaky. It hasn't been practiced.
Yes.
You need to keep it going. It's a system. See, that's what I think where I'm so glad that you emphasize that this is nothing wrong, nothing broken. It's how your body works. The problem is when the signal isn't modulated correctly, and that's because some other thing isn't, you're either lacking a nutrient, maybe an immune cell has gotten out of whack.
That's the question I wanted to segue into, is the system can get stuck. We're supposed to be able to sort of oscillate between going into the CDR when we need it and then coming out of it and restoring sort of, as Dr. Navio calls it, peacetime metabolism. Mitochondria are now shifting into, I call it energy mode. They're pumping out lots of energy, and we're no longer in wartime metabolism trying to defend against threats. But the problem is sometimes the CDR can get stuck in wartime metabolism. So explain why that is. What is, and you do a lot of work on chronic Lyme disease, Long COVID is a big focus of yours now, and you just did a summit on that. I don't know when it's coming out. When is it when is your summit
Next
coming
week,
out?
February 7th.
Okay, awesome. So we'll get this podcast out right away then. So obviously, I think this aspect that we're talking about here, as far as the CDR getting stuck, the body getting stuck, the mitochondria getting stuck in wartime metabolism, is a big part of these chronic illnesses. So what is happening there in terms of your paradigm?
Is that since this is a communication system, okay, and I'm sure there are multiple levels of it, but simplistically in my head, I usually focus on the immune system. Okay. And immune cells, by the way, also change, their mitochondria change just the same way, as an aside, but let's not go, I won't say more about that. But so I look at the immune system because it's like, you look at, well, long COVID is a great example. Okay. Is that who got really sick, who died, and who got long COVID? Many people thought they were healthy before they got sick. But usually when we dig down, we find that there was underlying insulin resistance, a old infection that their body, like an Epstein-Barr, like all of us have Epstein-Barr almost, but some of us are not, we have excessive amounts of B cells that still that have the EBV, the Epstein-Barr virus, living in there. Senescent, quiet, not reproducing, but every time that B cell reproduces, it can reproduce, and when it does, or you can reproduce a piece of it, and that can spark your immune system. So people live with that, and they don't notice it. They're just people that maybe, like, if they like work too hard and they exercise too hard, and they party too much, the next day they might really feel like crap and take 2 days to recover. But they just thought, it was nothing. But their immune system is always a little bit more amped up than normal. Okay, and so when they get sick, their immune system is already kind of on high alert, and it doesn't know how to go through the process of quieting itself down, because you see, another circle. People talk about the innate immune system and the like the macrophages and neutrophils and the T cells and the B cells, like everybody's got, and the NK cells, like everybody's got separate jobs. Okay, and they do on a gross level, but on the communication levels, if the neutrophils don't work right, don't send out the right signals, the macrophages don't work right. The macrophages don't work right. They don't give the T cells the right signals, and so the T regulatory and T helper signals don't work right. They all work because the system is so redundant, but the thing is that it has to work really well to get well. To simmer this, it's to let everybody know that the war is over. You have to have a good communication system. If you've got soldiers who are like in a like the Japanese soldier who they found, like the old story, the guy who was still fighting in the jungle like 40 years after the war ended, because nobody told him. Okay, well, that happens in your body. Okay, the communication drops a little bit. So what I find is that usually there's a toxin exposures that your body couldn't deal with. And just another quick aside for people, it's usually not the level of the toxic exposure, it's just your sensitivity to it. Because Dr. Navio he hasn't published it yet, but he looked at like 1,200 toxins in about 1,000 people. And the difference between the sick people and the healthy people, there really wasn't. Okay, really? In the quantity. Because, I mean, again, there's always the exception. If you get enough of something, you're going to eventually get sick. But we're talking about the levels that the government would like us to think is safe, because it's too complicated to realize how they're not.
So if it's not objectively differences in the degree of exposure, let's say the amount of virus that's present, the amount of Epstein-Barr virus that's in a person's system, the amount of mold toxins, the amount of other chemicals or heavy metals or something, then it has to be the individual's susceptibility to that, or ability to be resistant to that stressor. Is that
Yeah.
correct? Or
Yeah,
what,
it's
what else?
biochemical individuality.
Okay.
We are different. There are people who used to be able to work in battery factories that had incredible lead exposures, in the 50s. I mean, like, the lead levels that was considered acceptable. At least I remember by the 70s, they were down to 80. Now we know they should be down to nothing or one, I mean, like, microgram per liter. I mean, it's just, we didn't know. So the point is, but there were lots of people who worked in those factories who felt fine. And there are other people who walk in and worked for a day and went home and felt sick and had headaches.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So the difference in what we can, I mean, I can eat anything. People I live with, like if the food's out for a day, you'll give them a bellyache. I can eat stuff that's been sitting out for a week. We're all different. I mean, ApoE4 is probably good for something. We don't get infections. We might get, I mean, so that's what people have to understand. I always say is that we are alike. We all respond pretty much the same way to a bullet, but to a feeling, we all respond very differently. And to a bug, I mean, because 50% of people who had, I mean, they said something like in the beginning, 50% of people with COVID were asymptomatic.
Yeah.
So it's clear that it's us. And so the reason that people get stuck in CDR 1, 2, and 3 can be very variable. And one of the things that we were going to tie in, and I'm going to reach for it, is structure. Okay.
Yes.
Nobody talks about structure. One of the things that I see as a regular doctor is that people come in and nobody paid attention to how tight, how stuck, how things, like, they all, you might have chronic fatigue, but if your body isn't communicating with your left arm, because you had an old injury that never healed, well, that's going to get in the way of your healing because the blood flow is not going to be good there.
Well, that's also, I think, another example of like modern medicine versus old school medicine, in the sense of there used to be much more emphasis on physical assessment as far as the how the doctor deals with the patient. You assess them physically, and there was a whole art and skill set to that was dominant in how the doctor related to the patient. And now we've become increasingly reliant on lab tests and technology, and the art of physical assessment has been lost. So you can have a patient with obvious physical signs and symptoms going in, and the doctor will often completely miss it because they don't receive that training in physical assessment anymore.
Yeah, well, they often receive it, but they don't keep using it, so it doesn't do them any good. Because the thing about medicine is practice, because we don't know much. So it's only, quick aside, I have to tell this story. I realized, I've been in a new relationship for the last 5-6 years, and I now have I have a 13-year-old living with me now, and I have really come to grips with how little I know about the world. Okay, how many times somebody asked me a question, how does that work? And I start to give an answer, and I realize halfway through, I'm making this up. I mean, it's logical. It's how I think it works.
Yeah.
But I don't really know, and that has grabbed me. And it's just so, and we now live in a world that's so complex. It's so hard. And the reality is it's the same thing about medicine. I mean, I read and study, blah, 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 but I still, so much I don't know. Okay. But with experience, you can get a sense of a story, so there's a truth value there. Like, you don't really know how, you don't have to understand the physics of the tree to know which branch you can stand on if you know the type of tree. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that experience gives you information that you don't maybe have the rational or the step-by-step information for it. And that's where doctors are lacking now, because they're trying to do it by just the information that comes from testing. And that would imply that we understood the system well enough. But we don't. The tests are not black and white. Most of the tests that about all the chronic diseases, all the rheumatological diseases, they try to find the antibody. But there's no disease that has the antibody. Every one of them, every one of the rheumatological diseases, you can have the form that doesn't have that antibody. It's probably a different disease, but they don't know enough, so they lump it together because it kind of looks like it. So it just, I hate to be so demoralizing to people who think that doctors know what they're doing, but we do. But
and to doctors who think they know what they're doing.
Yeah. No, we know something. I always put it this way: in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Okay, and when it comes to being really ill, then you need your health practitioner person, because they do know more than you do. They at least know what the words mean. But don't, but you're, I always tell patients, you're on the inside. Okay, you're feeling what's going on. Now, my story and your feeling might not line up. Sometimes I'm right, sometimes you're right. We just gotta try to meet in the middle. But anyway, so getting back to this thing about structure, though, because structure is I think the big missing piece. Now, on the most extreme angle of the structure is we now have we're all very interested in what we're calling cranial cervical instability, and things like tethered cord, where people with Ehlers-Danlos, or actually a whole lot of other things that are not well defined yet, where people have lax connective tissue. Okay, it's very common. And it doesn't have to be in your whole body, which is even weirder. Some people just are very hyperflexible in one part, but there's some gene connections that increase inflammation when that's going on, among a whole lot of other things. But if you're really lax ligaments, in some people you can have where your head is not sitting as tightly on your neck as it should be. And so when you move or bend or just chew, your autonomic nervous system can start getting kerflooey, and you can start having rapid heart rates. You can have autonomic dysfunction, POTS, the whole 9 yards, just from this.
Wow.
Now, again, most people, it's mild. There's a few people who are bedbound with this stuff, and they're the people who, like 10 years ago, we kind of looked at, like, what the hell? They can't talk. They want the room dark and quiet, and they're not moving. And it's like, and again, you can be like that for lots of reasons, but one of them is this CCI, this cranial cervical instability. But more often, we're just seeing people who, and this ties in with the young lady you had on who was talking about the pelvis, the pelvic floor. And she brought up that most important point, is that the diaphragms, and you've got a diaphragm here as well, okay, when these are tight, you're not draining your brain. You actually you actually can get mild cranial hypertension, or more likely you're not getting enough drainage, so the toxins aren't leaving, and the inflammatory chemicals aren't leaving the system as quickly as they should, because they got to get out. They get in and they got to get out. And when these muscles are tight, the venous drainage system is a low pressure system, so it doesn't take much muscle tension to slow it down. And the lymphatics are a really low tension system, so it takes very little muscle tension to slow down the lymphatics, and that gives you a lot of head symptoms, which will affect your whole autonomic nervous system. So the point is that these things happen some things happen because you have, like I said, this lax connective tissue. Sometimes you're just defending yourself. Sometimes you just had a head trauma, and then your neck never loosens up again.
So I think this links back to something that you said in passing, and I want to connect the dots for listeners who may not be aware of this. But you mentioned earlier in passing something that I think probably would not make sense to a lot of people. You talked about somebody who can bend over and touch their toes very, very easily, uh, who you said something to the effect of maybe, yoga 5 times a week is not the right practice for you. That seems like an odd thing for a health practitioner to say, really in any context, for them to say, hey, like, don't do yoga, right? I don't find this to be odd because my best friend and my lifelong training partner is a world-class pain and posture expert and chiropractor, who now has his own online business called Pain Fix Protocol. His name's Dr. Yoni Witten, and he often talks about people who are hypermobile, and that he will advise them to stop doing yoga in many cases and to start weight training. And he talks like this is a category of people, right? That there's too much stretching, there's too much flexibility, there's too much joint mobility, there's too much hyperlaxity. And so we need to stiffen things up. But then I think the broader population in general, they're often too stiff and maybe could use more stretching and yoga and mobility practices, right? So how do you break that down? And I think more importantly than just the purely physical aspect of this, how do you think that this structural stuff, fascia, links into the broader context of healing and chronic disease?
It's all inflammation. Okay. If the fascia is the fascia is the communication, is part of the communication system. I mean, acupuncture meridians run through the fascia. The fascia envelops all the organs and helps keep them toned. Okay. When the fascial planes are stuck, then the organs can't move inside. I mean, like, we forget that everything inside is moving. Your liver isn't hanging there doing nothing. It's moving constantly, a little bit. I mean, like, and that's what you work with people with really good hands and they can feel it, but you can see it under an ultrasound. It's not like we're making it up. The organs move. There's a rhythmic motion inside the body at all times because it's how you increase flow and let the information flow, because remember, the lymphatics are your final drainage pathway, and if that connective tissue is tight, the lymphatics don't work well, so you wind up with fluid in the skin and just feeling tight and squishy, and you have chronic inflammation. Because this is the point, is that these cycles only work when information is flowing freely. And I always want to emphasize, I want people, I like psychological, analogies or metaphors. I can never get those straight. But, when, like, I keep going to the shoulder, because so many people have tight shoulders, and they fell on it once, or a very good example, I slipped walking, and I made the mistake of putting my wrist out. And I got it worked on a little bit, but it wasn't so bad. I forgot it. But years later, it started to really hurt and ache when I tried to use. And, just luckily, I have people I work with who are really good. And, they work through the fascia, the nerve stories that were happening. And it opened up, But most people don't do that. Mm-hmm. And that area was beginning to affect my neck and tightening up and causing pain. So it's... And here's the point I'm trying to make, is that when you're in a relationship and it's difficult, and you keep trying to communicate, and after a while you discover that that's a hot button subject, that if I talk about it, it just degrades into a fight. Mm-hmm. And so you stop talking about it. It kind of like you go over it, oops, it's like I always say, in Tai Chi, like when you can't make the move, you kind of go over that spot, Well, your body does the same thing. You start to ignore, when you have an area of inflammation, it sends signals back to the nervous system. Okay, help. We need more white blood cells, or we need more oxygenation, we need more blood flow, whatever. But when that keeps happening and you don't resolve the inflammation, the system shuts down.
Mm.
Okay, quiets down, because it stops wasting the energy. That's why when you start to get that area worked on again, it can really be very uncomfortable, because many times these old injuries, they don't hurt unless you push them. If you learn to like not move your arm in that thing, you don't notice it. But have somebody work on it, and then it can really hurt for a day or two, because you're returning information. You're returning that information exchange between the tissue and the central nervous system, where before the body just tried to decide to like turn it off. And so you're stuck in CDR 2 or 3. You haven't gotten out of it, but you're trying to cut down you're lowering the irritant factor, because if you don't get a lot of blood flow to that area, you're not getting as much of that inflammatory chemicals in the rest of your body. So you just
I've been studying human, my undergraduate degree is in kinesiology,
yes.
and I was a personal trainer for a long time, into bodybuilding from the time I was 13 years old. So, and an athlete from the time I was much younger, 5 years old. I'm going to turn 40 this year. So this has been an obsession of mine for, let's say, close to 30 years at this point, as far as understanding human biomechanics, exercise physiology, movement, all of these things, muscles and fat and bone and skeletal stuff. And even I've got many years of study of mitochondria and the CDR and all this stuff. And even I've never made the connection that you just described between putting things together in that way, linking up what's going on in the musculoskeletal system and how that's tying into this story of cellular communication and the CDR. That's really, even for me, that was a very profound insight to hear you put the pieces together like that.
Oh, thank you. It's because I always watched chiropractors help people in my early days, and I go, what the hell are they do? And then I took a year of osteopathic training to learn, and I studied a bit, and I got, so. I got good enough to know that it was really useful, and then I hired people to work with me who are really good. Mm-hmm. And when you start to watch them work with tissue, and you start to see these things open up, it's like, oh, okay. Because, again, people with with these chronic illnesses, and until you can restore the flow between the chest, like the mediastinum, that area between that nobody thinks about, like between your heart and lungs and your esophagus and the thorax, that area is stuck in so many people who are sick for a long time. And the sympathetic nerves that come on along that mid-thoracic spine, that's why everybody has that stuff between their scapulas, between their shoulder blades all the time, because it's all tied up. And when you open it and you get a little more flow there, it's step one. Then you can open their neck. If you open the neck first, it makes a mess. They feel terrible. That's why you need people with good hands. That's the other part, is that I think that someday, if I was going to have like the way to help people really recover from chronic illness, is if we could have a consortium of people who are like gifted body workers. I don't care if you're an osteopath or a massage therapist who's just got great hands, because it's a gift. It's like everybody always wants to think it was my piece of paper. Yeah, it's how good you are.
Yeah.
And so, but then the training, because the thing that happens is a lot of people go to these folks, and if you're chronically ill, they'll flare the hell out of you. And it's not because they did anything wrong. It's because they weren't used to working with that kind of body. Mm-hmm. I've had, we have people who it's just, you have to start with very gentle, because this is the cell danger response again. People, your brain, remember that intention, as we said in the beginning. Well, your intention is there, but if fear is overwhelming the intention, because every time something happens to you, you feel worse. Every time somebody gives you something, every time somebody makes a loud noise, your whole nervous system vibrates. Okay, you begin to become more and more well defended, for good reason. If you're chemically sensitive and every time you smell something, you get a headache and nausea, life becomes very not fun. And the defense pulls in, and that pulls in everything, and it pulls in the psyche. And that's where, so for some people, if they'll hear it, the first step is working with the psyche. Except unfortunately, since most of my patients have been told that they're just crazy to begin with, you can't start right with the psyche because it's insulting. I'm not, it's not in your head. It's just that your head has a lot to do with running the show.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if your heart's racing 130 beats a minute every time you walk across the room, your brain's going to keep thinking there's a lot of danger here. I mean, and it's not a conscious thought. It's your limbic system just feeding back this to your body. And so this is what keeps that CDR going. It's all this information. And the mitochondria are one piece that are reading these signals because they happen because there's less blood flow. There's less nutrients when you're tight. Mitochondria don't like that. Mm-hmm. That's a sign that there's a problem. I mean, so it's relaxation is the hardest thing. I mean, because it takes, I think I told you this before, it's one of my favorite little tidbits, is how relaxation takes more energy than being tense. Mm-hmm. And when you're really sick and have no energy, you don't have the energy to relax. Because you got to pump a lot of ATP to stay relaxed.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Gordon, I feel like I could talk to you for 5 more hours.
I know. We really.
Thank you for going way over our allotted hour. I think this has been a lot of fun. Now, I have a challenge for you.
Yeah.
And this is definitely a challenge. I feel like this conversation has been to some extent, it's just you and I having fun here and speaking to each other and having a conversation and back and forth. I feel like there's a possibility that this could be a frustrating conversation for some listeners who may have difficulty following some of the things that have come up in this conversation and may feel a little discombobulated as far as making sense of it. What are the takeaways? I would like to ask you to give, if possible, a succinct, high-level summary of, okay, here are some of the signs and symptoms that characterize this state of physiology that we've been discussing. And then from there, I'd like you to leave listeners with 3 practical takeaways as far as things to focus on or work on if this state of physiology applies to them. And I think the theme of, if I can insert my own commentary here, the theme of what I've heard you say here has a lot to do with cellular communication. So maybe 3 tips to help restore cellular communication and get the body back into health. But see, I know it's a challenge, but do your best with that challenge.
Yes, no, I appreciate how difficult it is to follow me sometimes. I'm always thankful for the people who give me the space. Okay, so to me, chronic inflammation is underlying all illness. That's simple. Okay, I don't care if it's heart disease, Lyme disease, COVID, arthritis, whatever, anxiety and depression is all chronic inflammation.
So should we all take non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs to solve it?
No, because see, that's the problem. That's the linear approach, is to think, but it's a communication problem. Okay. So cutting one wire is not going to be helpful. We have to restore the communication. And because this is a system that we don't understand, we have to approach it with a little humility. So for the simple things, okay, is that so any illness that doesn't go away, any sensation in your body that does not go away is chronic inflammation in that area. Okay. So with that being said, I don't want to sound simplistic, but the first steps are obviously intention, which means open your heart to the possibility of healing, and really see it. I'm going to try to keep it succinct. I was going to tell people how I hated that thought I hate affirmations. Okay. I was anti-affirmation, but I've come to see if you can do it gently, affirmation that somebody gave you in a book and you're doing by rote, it might help a little bit, but you got to find it in your heart. Okay. It's not a memorized thing. It's a unique relationship between you and whatever is bigger than you. Even if you're a total atheist, there's still the awe that this whole system works. So just have an intention to heal in that space of awe. That's it. But it's not easy to do when you feel terrible. Okay. And obviously the things that you teach, breath work signals the body. When you are breathing shallowly and tightly, you're signaling danger. Okay. Just think all the things that you do when you're afraid, when you get scared of something, every body posture that you take, the hunched shoulders, the tightness, the gut a little tight, those are all signals to your body that it's not safe. So, and again, obviously, unfortunately, when you've been sick a long time, it's probably not comfortable to change those positions a lot. But gently pay attention to them. Just breathe into them. You're not going to go from like hunched over and in pain to like suddenly being sitting blah blah be like a yogi. But put an intention there. And again, and the rest. I mean, I feel so ridiculous because I used to get so upset when that's all people would go to doctors and they would come with these prescriptions that just had these things. I'd go, my God, what a waste of time and money, because I love the Band-Aids and the toys and the things, but when it comes down to it, the basics, if you can't begin, you don't have to do all of them. That's the beauty of the body. If you do one of the 10 things that people tell you to do, it'll shift a little bit. And then maybe you can do the second. The rest is the other thing, because without rest, your brain doesn't relax. And if your brain's not relaxed, it's like when mama's not happy, nobody's happy. Well, this is mama. I mean, so you gotta do that. Again, and again, it's very hard because most people who are really inflamed, it doesn't relax. Because I said it takes energy, and you're not producing energy. So you have to start often with the breath and the intention, because sleep will come later. And then a little bit of movement. And I don't care if the movement is walking to the toilet, okay? Instead of using a bedside commode, but try to make a few steps, or just in bed. If you're bedbound, just move. And I'm not talking about doing marathons, because that's not good for you. Marathons, I don't think are good for people anyway, but in general. But unless you grew up with it. But but if you love to run. But for most people, walk. Just remember, imagine a day in a life when you didn't have a car and you didn't have a bus or a bicycle. You had to walk. Just do that once in a while for those who are a little healthier. I mean, I tend to go to the really, like people who are bedbound or housebound, but there's lots of people who feel miserable who can still get out and move around. It's just that it doesn't feel good. They feel like they're sick all the time. And just the thing is, move as much as comfortable and don't push yourself. Because the thing about inflammation is that when you are pushing yourself, you're creating that, as you said before, that hermetic stress, but it's no longer hermetic for you. You're not learning. Okay. You're breaking yourself. So you want to practice that your movement and your exercise does not leave you more tired than when you started. If you wake up the next morning and you can ache, but if you're more tired, you did way too much. Okay. That is not healing. Okay, because remember that all that exhaustion is telling your body again that something's a problem. You want to make love to you want your body to be like your baby. Like you just want your baby to feel safe and happy. And you have to treat your own being like that, which is really hard because I don't most of the time.
I want to just extend that out slightly further, because there's a philosophy that I don't object to, but I think there's a possible interpretation of what you just said that I wouldn't agree with.
Okay, let me hear it. Yeah.
So um, to maybe broaden this a bit, there is an attitude that I find some people are forming in relationship to stress and trauma.
Oh,
Right now, we're in an era where there's, I think, more awareness than ever around like emotional trauma, and I think we have a kind of a cultural zeitgeist, a way of relating to that now, where it's kind of like we're all very hyper focused and obsessed with the traumas of our past and how they have led to us being a certain way, and how maybe we're forever sort of damaged as a result of this, and this. And I think what's missing in this is more resilience, more mental toughness, and not to be insensitive to people with really severe trauma. Of course, there's, you know, like I fully understand that it's possible to be really messed up from very serious trauma. However, I think we also need to incorporate, just to go back into your analogy of treating it like a baby. Okay, if we're raising a child, it is not helpful for that child to be forever shielded from stress and difficulty and challenge. It is part of them learning how to become better, how to become stronger physically, mentally, how to become more resilient in the face of stress, how to develop more grit, how to develop more persistence, how to develop their skill sets in various regards by being challenged. And so we have to continually brush up against challenge and obstacle and difficulty and stress in order to be formed into our best self. So I think the mentality, which I think a lot of people have, to be quite honest with you, of feeling like they need to constantly shield themselves and avoid stress, because stress is this very harmful thing that will damage them and mess them up, is an immature relationship to stress.
yeah, and let me 100%. I see what I mean. 100%. I agree with you. I mean, like, one of my favorite sayings that gets me in trouble with the young people today is the old, when I was growing up, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
I have no tolerance. I'm old, so I have to learn for this thing about, like, God forbid you. Yeah. But that being said, what I'm dealing with is many times the nervous system has become so sensitized
Yeah.
that everything feels like a stress.
Right.
So, for a while as a transition, yes, but because I always tell people is that, like, when I was, I mean, any kind of war, is that, like, when I was growing up, there were, people were getting killed by snipers in Beirut, and my going out to the store. So I go, I always knew I didn't grow up in Beirut. It was New York. It was dangerous, but basically it was pretty safe,
Yeah.
But the thing is that once the nervous system becomes sensitized, everything starts being felt that way. So a big part of doing these things is learning how to reinterpret
Right.
the things that are not stressful. So
Yeah.
my point is that the next day when you wake up, if you're just tired, if you just ache because you overworked it, that's good. But if you wake up and you feel malaise and sick, see, that's the difference, is that you're not going to push past malaise and sick. You're going to get sicker. Achy, you can push past, okay? Because achy, your body's just healing. But malaise and sick is you've gone into that CDR1 in a big way. You're flooding your body with these chemicals that say you're sick, different than when you're just hurt. And so this is, and I guess I tend to go overboard because my world is made up of people that, even if they were very tough people, and many of them were, because I mean, that's the thing that I always laugh when people tell me these folks have psychological issues. Many of these people were top of their game, and then they got sick.
Yeah.
And the world starts going, oh, I knew you were really a wimp. Usually brothers and sisters have that line,
Yeah.
but still, I just want to double down, is that you will not rest your way back to health.
Yes.
Okay, no, 100%, Ari. I really, really agree with you that this idea that, because your body needs the stress to know how to grow.
Yes.
It just needs it. It's required. It's just that the thing is, we have to keep it within the bounds. And that's why you start with the breath work. You have to find ways that you can rescue yourself when you get that fear signal that's not necessary. I mean, that's where like those training programs that a lot of people have, I don't know, I felt about naming names, but the different programs where people like are retraining the amygdala and the limbic system to not overreact to this noise, because people can, because when you start feeling not well, some nervous systems demand retreat, because it's how we come into this world. I really believe this, and I almost every patient I see was always the sensitive one in their family. They felt either physically or just sometimes emotionally when things were off, when they were little. And so that's a beautiful gift. They often have very fine senses of taste, wonderful, for their mouth and ears, and they can smell everything. It's a gift. But once that sensitivity gets used to start sniffing out danger instead of pleasure, you're on a downward road, and we have to find a way to make you feel safe again to get you back out there. But we don't want to make you safer by denying you interaction, because I'm always dealing with people like, take off those eye shields, take off those ears. I mean, we got to make it quiet, but slowly expose yourself, and get out of your family's house. That's the other thing that people get pissed off with me, because no adult sick person should be living with their families. I mean, economics sometimes has to, but what Ram Dass said, you think you're enlightened, go home for the weekend.
Yeah, go home for Thanksgiving, right?
Right. And imagine when you're sick, we all revert to 3 or 5. The sickness behavior usually brings us back to that 3-year-old, 2-year-old level of coexistence. And you're dealing with the person who knows you really well at that age. You glom right back there. It's such a tragedy, because the families want to help. And sometimes it's the only option, I know, but it's always something to try to grow out of. It's like growing out and learning to like push your body a little more. You'll be much better if you're interacting with people who are going to interact with where you are today, not who you were in the past. I'm sorry, I digress.
No, that's beautiful. And Dr. Gordon, is there one more thing maybe that you can think of that you want to leave people with, just to fully conclude here?
Oh, and the other obnoxious thought is, eat organic, I don't care what your diet is, but make sure it suits you, and don't go too crazy if things bother you. Don't get down to eating 4 foods. Okay. I have seen people crumple their bones in their 40s because they been on a restrictive diet for 10 years. I mean, it's not necessary. I can only tell you is that's your nervous system giving you false information. Okay. You have to fix the gut, have to fix the nervous system, have to make it so every time that you get a sensation that's painful, that you don't relate it to what just happened. Okay, we make that, our brain loves to make up stories. That's why conspiracy stories are so pleasing to us. We like to know that A happened because of B. It's very simple. And we like to know that, like, I got nausea again because I had that, that food, or I got the headache, or I got anxious because I ate that, and it might be. I'm not saying it's not, but don't cut out the food because of that. Work harder at figuring out what else is imbalanced in your gut, that it's amplifying the signals to your vagus nerve so crazily. Fix that. Don't cut out the foods and think I'm going to fix this gut later. Because there is no later. The longer you avoid foods, like you said, the less stress, the less healthy. This is the paradox of this whole system, is that yes, you have to love it and relax in it, but if you don't use it and stress it and push yourself to your limit occasionally, you just wilt. There's no life. It's that simple. It's that complex. It's just that, and when you're sick, the desire to prevent more pain is so strong. And that's what I want to be really clear. You know, it's easy for me to sit here who's not having anything, you know, and say these things. And when you're suffering and it really hurts all over, it's hard. But if you just stay in the suffering, it doesn't get better. And it's that unfortunately ugly, simple, and offensive, because usually we're told that by parents and brothers and sisters. And we get that, you know, that just defensive response. And you have to like just go, okay, put it down and know that on some level, even though they're speaking it with maybe a little bit of edge and a little bit of oomph, there might be a little knife there, there's still truth there. You got to work at it and you got to move forward, and you can't just try to hide from the pain, unfortunately.
Yeah.
You know,
okay. To everybody listening, I want to say one thing. This is Dr. Gordon. This has been a really unique discussion, and I've gained a lot of insights and had a lot of aha moments just myself in this conversation with you, and I'm very grateful for having you on and for all of your time that you've invested just for my own selfish benefit. I found this really interesting and insightful. For everybody listening, I feel like at some points in this conversation, there's certain sort of assumptions of knowledge around, you know, we kind of went over the CDR quite briefly, and some of this discussion might feel high level and inaccessible. I would really encourage and may feel a bit discombobulated, kind of all over the place at different times, and kind of piecing things together and looping back to certain stuff. I'm sensitive to the fact that some people may be frustrated by that, but I really feel there's a lot of gold nuggets in this conversation. And I would encourage listeners, especially anyone who's listening to this with any kind of chronic, complex illness, chronic symptoms really of any kind, including chronic fatigue, listen to this a second time and try to, I think you'll start to see how circular a lot of these elements that we touched on are, and you'll put the pieces together in a lot of new ways. And I think you'll get a lot of nuggets out of this conversation. Dr. Gordon, you are a uniquely brilliant mind. This has been a lot of fun. I really love the way that your brain works. And again, super insightful just for my own personal benefit. Thank you so much for all your time, for staying with me for nearly 2 hours. And I look forward to our next conversation. I'm sure there will be one sometime soon.
Okay, well, I just want to thank you, Ari, for your patience, and I hope you gave me enough rope to just have fun. And really, I just want people to know that there is hope, and in all these circles, there are answers. And I know it's frustrating to listen to me for long periods of time. So I wish I could be more linear, but
You're very humble. I mean, I'm very engaged. I find it fascinating. So
okay, because I feel badly because I speak to many people who I do a lot of interviews where I let other people do the talking, and I appreciate how when people can give information in a very linear and useful manner to people. And I just have to acknowledge that my brain just doesn't work that way. And when I've tried to produce scripts, I still just wander. So,
well, I think my brain works a lot like yours, and there's
no,
like layers of knowledge, and the brain is kind of in real time piecing things together and making connections. And sometimes you're over here, and then you want to connect it to something over here, and come back to this thing and connect it to that thing over there. And I find it fascinating. I really like the way your brain works, and this was a lot of fun.
Good, and I hope, like I said, I hope people don't get too irritated by it, because I do run across people who do, and I respect that, because it's not everyone's cup of tea. But again, thank you, Ari. It was just delightful. I say the same here. I just learned so much when I talk to you and I listen to your stuff. It's really good.
Awesome. So, beautiful to hear that. Last thing is, where can people find you if they're interested in following your work, working with you, anything like that? Where do you want to send people?
Well, we have our website, gordonmedical.com. Named after me, and we really encourage. I'm actually launching something new where I'm going to be taking on people for not research project, but really going deep dives into their problems, because I now have some associates that work with me who can organize me. Okay, because I've always wanted to do this, but if people need information that comes back to them in an organized fashion. And that's what kept me from doing it. And people need this, because when you talk to me for an hour on the phone and you tell me about your symptoms and I have ideas and we try this and we do that, but then there's a whole lot of stuff that needs to be researched, because I don't have the answers to everything. And I know other smart people who do, or I know where to look for it. And so that's a new program that I'm going to be offering if they want to, if they're interested. They'll talk to Rachel, is the person in the office who deals with all the new patient calls. And it's a new program that I think is really going to be useful to people, because, far beyond the make an appointment and get an assessment and then follow up and we do a few things. It's that, but plus a deeper dive to make sure we're not wasting your time, because when you reach what I don't know, I need the time to make sure I can go figure it out. Mm-hmm. And I like to do that, but life being life, I don't always.
Yeah. And say again where people should reach out.
Just gordonmedical.com. There's info, I think it's email info at gordonmedical.com. That works, Okay. And reach out, and you can try Rachel at gordonmedical.com. That will get you directly to Rachel, and she's wonderful, and she knows what we do and how we think, and can help people decide whether we're appropriate. Because awesome. The last thing I want to do is see people who I'm not for. It's kind of a waste of everybody's time and money. So
wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Gordon. It was an absolute pleasure.
Blessings. Thank you.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at the Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next